Mr. Speaker, we think that feminism that most women ascribe and can relate to is the most effective form of feminism. We think that hypersexualization of the body of the women is a kind of very ultra-liberal and very privileged kind of feminism that perpetuates existing standards in the status quo that seclude and silence many, many voices of women. We would like feminism to instead focus on ideas and reconciling these ideas so that conservative women are included, so that women in developing countries can relate to the cause that feminism pushes, and that the intersectionality of male identity and their body are considered in the agenda of feminism. We think hypersexualization, such as in the case of mainstream media where, say, actors pictures of themselves, or like simply people uploading to social media what the body means to them, and in a very hypersexualist way, is damaging and contrary to all strategic goals of feminism. I will talk about two things in my speech. First of all, about how this is a dangerous construction of what it means to be empowered and how it excludes other kinds of feminism and influences the lived experiences of women. And second, on how it brings real consequences and harms at the individual level to women. So on to my first argument on how this is a very unfair and dangerous construction of what it means to be empowered. We think that hypersexualization and the trend that comes with it necessitates a definition of empowerment that is liberal, full of nudes and photographs, one that says women's sexuality cannot be private. It's a good thing, of course, for those who subscribe to it. But this is already a very privileged kind of feminism where you can only post nudes or be sexually adventurous in societies where it is accepted and more permissible. At the starting point, therefore, it is already an equal playing ground between these agendas, right? But this kind of empowerment specifically also includes the narratives of other women. Conservative Muslim in Egypt who seek power through community involvement, for example, a sense of and women with their hijab in Afghanistan in relation to the Taliban, no thank you. Or simply women who would like to keep their sexuality private. And even for those in these countries and outside of the Western context who would like to subscribe to the same ideal of hypersexualization, this is still unfair because not like everyone, for example, women in rural villages or the Middle East, can afford this kind of political feminism, right? We think that this is especially relevant because hypersexualization obscures the nuances and ideals of these experiences because by definition it crowds out others. In pushing for feminism agendas, you compete, no thank you, for the attention of the mass. We argue that several definitions or several agendas of feminism cannot necessarily compete at the same level with the same kind of balance to gain popularity with the masses at the same time. Why? This is especially true in the case of hypersexualization, because not only does it utilize the Western media platform, which is inherently always more loud than, say, other kinds of media who consider the voices of other women, but with images of the female body, of breast, of ass, which draw more public sensation, no thank you, and attention, that is already existing in society, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We think that for feminists to push their agendas, there needs to be a strategic consideration on which cause gains the spotlight of the public, no thank you. And we simply argue that simply by the definition and the sensational nature of hypersexualization, I'll take you in a moment, that the women push through social media, through Western narratives, it necessarily silences other kinds of platforms because they cannot balance at the same time.
In order for us to embrace and acknowledge the nuances in one, can you tell us what is an acceptable standard and what it means to sexualize yourself?
Simple. We think that the push for more agendas that are universal and are more relevant to women across the world, such as the push against domestic violence, the more empowerment for women in their religious attires, for example, and the cause for women in labor communities in developing countries that are very, very silenced by the popularity that hypersexualization currently gains in the feminist discourse, Mr. Speaker. We think that there are many, many more universal causes, such as the ones pushed by Emma Watson in the United Nations, for example, that are more relevant to every kind of women that exists in society, as opposed to some women who want to hypersexualize themselves. And precisely because of the nature of the gaining of the spotlight in pushing for feminist causes, we don't think those two can coexist with the same degree. So in this case, there is less space for different ideas and ideals and the lived experiences of women to be considered, simply because now you construct a definition of empowerment that silences others. On to my second argument on how at the individual level, this is very harmful to women themselves. So we think there are two kinds of groups of people who are affected by the popularity of hypersexualization: women viewers and men viewers. These are equally damaging to both. Onto the women. We think that the viewers of these popularity of hypersexualized images are young girls, teenage girls, and women who aspire to be like the ones portrayed in the pictures that they see on their phones. Right? We think that with the current pre-existing ideals of what a woman's body should look like, or how the popularity of how there is a trend on what kind of body is desirable to gain more popularity in the hypersexualized context of feminism. No, thank you. This is especially damaging because when these viewers see a current trend, which is true in the status quo, you only tend to see a certain kind of female body in a specific region to show you what an ideal body looks like, Mr. Speaker. I think this is inherently damaging not only to the conception of what beauty is like for these young girls who conceptualize what it means to be a woman, but also has the potential to cause body image issues, for example, insecurities, when they find themselves different from the trend that they find in the status quo. And we think this is inherently harmful because you cannot simply say that there exists a diversity of body ideals in the media. The case with hypersexualized image, even the women who upload them are often very self-conscious about what kind of standards are accepted. And for that reason, this harms that construction of what it means to be beautiful. But second of all, we think that men also view these kind of images. And with the trend that I have explained, men will have more expectations on what an ideal woman should look like. I think that with the prevalence of hypersexualization, this simply cannot be avoided. And for the women who receive this kind of unfair burden of expectation from the men in their communities and families, with the current prevalence of power imbalance in society, where women often have less bargaining power and often appear to a certain ideal to please men, we think this is not a good thing. I've proven to you that this silences other experiences of women and is harmful at the individual level. Side between them.
Thank you. We have a little opportunity.
Actually, talking is about.
Oh, right. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, men often accept criticism as a punishment, but women accept criticism as a natural God-given right. And we think that this is problematic in the approach in which we discuss the discussion surrounding empowerment and what type of empowerment are we able to cultivate and what broad categories will we then essentialize feminism into, ladies and gentlemen. Before I move on to my three arguments: one, what does it mean to be a prominent female and the value of embracing your bodily autonomy? Number two, why do we think the discussion surrounding the impacts and the reactions of individuals directly captured in the Prime Minister? Thirdly, why we think an essentialized notion of feminism of a monolithic version is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. Several points of responses. Number one, we think that Prime Minister was unable to tell us what is the value of being a prominent woman in society, a prominent female in society to begin with. I'm going to answer this. We don't think that the role of being a prominent female in society is about a collective larger duty to set examples to individuals of what you're supposed to be like. We think that oftentimes when you are talking about empowerment, it's always about me and my own predetermination of what it means to feel empowered, ladies and gentlemen. Because the rhetoric is simple. No one else can tell me what it means to be a woman, and no one else can claim to me what it means to be empowered, and therefore we don't let these women take a position of imposing the same set of standards to other women in the community, ladies and gentlemen. We don't regret it, but if you accept that they do, we think it's problematic because women can't do it just because other people will react in a negative way, or just because you have to sacrifice your values, and we don't accept that as a principle when you're talking about a role. Secondly, we also think that society has moved on in embracing a diversified concept of what it means to be sexy, ladies and gentlemen. Like you have people like Anna Kendrick and like Kim Kardashian on different spectrum of what constitutes sexy. That's why my point of information was extremely important and wasn't responded to. What is an acceptable standard of sexualization? She responded by saying, we have more universal rights that we need to fight for, and this isn't a concern. Here's my response. Number one, they are shying away from the debate on sexual independence and calling it like something that is unimportant or something that is uncomfortable to discuss about. We will argue that you can't delink sexual independence and the fight for empowerment because oftentimes the discussion of empowerment often ties back to the sort of sexual independence that you can have for an individual. And it can extend to many different discussions. Things like health control, things like reproductive rights, things like menstruation, Mr. Speaker, are often things that are intertwined in the fight for empowerment, and we don't think they can just claim we shouldn't talk about it because it makes us uncomfortable. Firstly, let's look at the role of these individuals and why we don't regret it in assessing their bodily autonomy. Let's acknowledge, when you talk about hypersexualized female figures, we will argue that these are individuals at the end or at the fringes of that discussion. No, thank you. The reason is because we think that oftentimes taking a position of being a hypersexualized person requires a lot of risk because you're putting yourself out there to a higher form of criticism. And often women take these things into consideration and make active and conscious decision to still portray themselves in a hypersexualized manner, even though they accept that I might be rejected, ladies and gentlemen. And the reason is because we will argue, ladies and gentlemen, we think that it allows for the more broad definition or broad spectrum of discussion surrounding feminism. Because we think in status quo, there is a predetermined bias that determines or that dictates what constitutes what it means to be a good woman. So you have to be modest, you have to be understanding, you have to be assertive but not really aggressive. You can be confident but you can't be really bossy, ladies and gentlemen. And we don't regret it because there is value in how they appreciate and impact their roles in society. We think when you're talking about bodily autonomy, there is power, no thank you, in embracing the sexuality or the hypersexualized notion of what it means to be a woman. Everything is great and they're pushing the boundaries, ladies and gentlemen, because often right now in status quo, there is a paradox that women face. It's a Madonna whore complex. So you have to be pure in some regards, but in the bedroom, you have to be a dirty whore, right? And we think that there's no like middle ground to how women are supposed to behave. Often it's a binary, and that's problematic. So why we don't regret it is that at the very least, these individuals are creating a spectrum to what it means to be a sexual woman, and these are a form of sexuality that should be appreciated. No, thank you, sir. What happens if you bow down? We think, especially for these women, you are compromising your values and your position, especially acknowledging that you are taking a higher risk in portraying yourself as a hypersexualized being, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you. And we think that's problematic. We don't think individuals should just sacrifice their values just to make it more palatable to individuals. Secondly, we don't think women do this to impose a form of position onto other individuals. It's a form of synergistic management solutions, Mr. Speaker. It's all about re-strategizing the narrative that you have in status quo. We think we have to create broader categories of feminism and empowerment and what it means to be a hypersexualized female. So, for example, in status quo, I agree with the first speaker. There are liberal biases that determine what constitutes a good form of feminism, right? We think right now what you have is conservative feminists prejudged in the notion of what it means to be sexual. But we think what it does, it creates a broader discussion. Because right now, conservative feminists can come forward and say, that's one spectrum of what it means to be a hypersexualized female. I'm going to now present to you my more moderate, tempered down position that's attached to my cultural values, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore, the argument of competing with limelight doesn't necessarily materialize in the way that they want. Because right now, people can choose to follow an identity that is more broad. They can pick and choose what sort of feminism do they want, or what form of empowerment that they want, ladies and gentlemen. So people who don't appreciate the conservatives that I'm talking about can do many things. One, they can denounce what they want, or number two, we think that the deprivation of rights within those areas isn't contingent upon hypersexualization. We don't think they were able to prove the likelihood of like women being given the right to drive, or like taking away the right to drive just because you have Kim Kardashian posting a nude selfie. Or thirdly, we think that it is problematic for you to bow down to the systems of patriarchy to make it more palatable. Yes?
You're right. This debate isn't about what it means to be a woman. It's about what it means to be a good feminist. We think that with celebrities creating this hypersexualization, they're ultimately setting the standard for what it means to be a woman. What's your thoughts?
We can build on the thoughts on more. And that's a comparative that we provide. Lastly, in dealing with this point of information, we think what it does on that side of the house, it essentializes the notion of feminism to a monolithic version. So you have a good feminism, as what he says, right? So you have to be this set standard of like X model in order for you to be categorized as a good feminist. And we're looking at it a great thing, because the great thing about feminism in general, ladies and gentlemen, is that it acknowledges that there is a spectrum of women and a spectrum of empowerment that they can choose to have. That's why things like fourth wave feminism, denouncing other feminist groups and saying you can't sit with us, it's problematic because they say there is an X standard of what it means. Or when Chloe Grace Moritz called out Kim Kardashian by saying you're not empowered women just because you post a nude selfie, ladies and gentlemen. We think when you're talking about feminism and the right to forward identity-based movement, you have to acknowledge the fact that there is a spectrum and individuals should be allowed to embrace the different sort of qualities that exist under that side, under our side of the house. It's not enough to ask people for your rights. We think you have to demand it, right? And the ability for individuals to view themselves as sexual beings, determine their behavior, determine how they treat themselves, determine how they allow other people to treat themselves, ladies and gentlemen, which will allow for empowerment to exist. I'm very proud of this.
Thank you.
Feminism is about reducing oppression, and feminism is about actually equalizing the status of women to those of men. We cannot allow for a feminism that A, is accessible to the very few, and B, presents an image of a woman that is unrealistic, that is very difficult to achieve, that has very significant individual harms to which they have not responded. The only kind of feminism, even if we agree that we essentialize it to the point that there is a good kind of feminism, is still the one that is most inclusive of the different women that exist in the world. On their side of the house, their kind of feminism excludes those women because it's a very visceral, it's a very loud, it's a very empowering kind of feminism through the lens of a man. And we see that as a very problematic thing, and that will be my constructive material. It's a shame when women who aspire to reduce oppression in the world do not want to subscribe to feminism, because they believe that the kind of feminism that is prominent is not theirs, and that the kind of feminism does not belong to them, and thus they are excluded. To mitigate that, we offered our case. So before I get into the argument, I'll talk about a few points that they brought up. So first of all, they talked about this, what is prominence, and how is that important, and whether you're prominent, you have a duty to portray yourself at a certain light. So we believe that yes, if you are a feminist role model, if you have a wide-ranging influence, a huge audience, particularly kids, children that aspire to be like you do, especially if you brand yourself feminism, have a duty to women, and you do have a duty to those women that then develop unrealistic body standards, that hate themselves when they look in the mirror because they cannot be, and they cannot have the kind of ass that Kim Kardashian does. We believe that it's very detrimental, and exactly those kinds of detriments sit down, they didn't want to deal with it at all in their speech, and that is very problematic. And this is a regret emotion, which we believe means that we feel shame that this kind of feminism exists because it marginalizes other women. This doesn't have to do anything about autonomy. This doesn't have to do anything what it means to be a good woman. And that's one other point that they brought. We don't believe this is a debate about what it means to be a good woman. We still believe that if women want to be sexual or if women want to be modest, that is totally their prerogative. What we regret is people taking the spotlight, women taking the spotlight with that kind of feminism, because we believe that because of its viscerality, because of its popularity, because of its image-based, and because it panders to the man, in many instances what happens, it becomes the most dominant type of feminism. It crowds out the constructive feminism that we believe is universal, because more people, regardless of how conservative you are, can subscribe to that. And only through that lens can we ensure that little girls do want to be feminists, that conservative women do want to be feminists, that women in the developing world want to be feminists. We believe that that is a very important thing. But they talk about risk, that it is empowering because you take on a risk and it's very dangerous for you to do. So you go against societal norms. Yes, we can agree to that. But we unfortunately see that in many instances that risk is only afforded to a very select few people. You already have to be rich and famous, first of all, have that perfect body type. Second of all, third of all, you already have to exist in a culture in which this kind of exposition is more permissible. You cannot do that in a very conservative country, because if you are not going to be actually punished for doing that, what is going to happen? You're going to have severe social repercussions. Thus, this is an inaccessible form of protest and empowerment for the majority of women in the world.
There's a spectrum of women and a spectrum of like empowerment and democracy to choose. Why not conservative feminists come forward and say, that's not the empowerment that I want, here's the more moderate version.
I'll talk about that in essentializing, but because there's a spectrum of women doesn't mean that feminism should not be used as a political tool to unify the most feminists as possible. What we are trying to propose is a feminism that is most unifying of all women. We do not have an exposition of some sort of feminist that is on the fringe of radicalness in this sense, because it's only accessible to a few. We are fine. Feminism is also a political tool. You cannot have a political tool that has everything across the spectrum. What you try to do is you try to bring the most people together so it's most accessible to everyone. That's very important. Now, we also talk about what is sexualization, and they say that there's no like baseline for sexualization, which we say they're completely blind to the world that exists today. Because of Western influences, because of liberal influences, because of the media, and because of men specifically, there is a baseline sexuality that you need to fulfill to be appealing to a lot of people. Sure, there may be variation, but if you actually look at what most feminists in this kind of discourse do and what they display, it's very uniform, because there's at least baseline need for them to have the perfect body type, to be very, very slim, to usually have a large breast or a large ass, and that is a very, very, very damaging thing to a lot of the individuals that cannot have that and that feel discriminated and that feel oppressed because that double standard exists. And the problem is, if they blame us for essentializing feminism, they do the same thing by hijacking all of the attention through this kind of expression and actually imposing a standard on women. Another layer of oppression to deal with on top of the one that they already have to deal with just by virtue of being women in the world. And that is very problematic. Their only benefit that we see was it creates discussion, because these are very radical people and then other women want to discuss these ideas. So two things to that. We don't think that there's much discussion if it hijacks most of the attention. It becomes the norm. We have seen Western liberal feminism hijack the feminism platform many times, when in the 80s and the 90s, they so fervently denounced the hijabs as those modest women cannot be feminists in any way, and they're just playing into the subjugation of the men in their countries. We believe that has happened many times, and that is happening right now just based on the popularity that this movement is gaining. So why is this empowerment dangerous? Because we believe that only way you can be appreciated as a sexual being is through the eyes of the one that sees you as sexual, which is usually the man. So the problem is that in this case, we already have a lot of objectification when it comes to women. Women are seen as objects, women are seen as body parts, women are seen as sex partners, women are seen as something that you're supposed to be pleased with when you see them. And that plays into the narrative of the male gaze. Because the only way this kind of feminism can exist is by appeasing the men that see you as very sexual and that see you as very, very beautiful and very pretty. So this kind of feminism is self-limiting because it will always be dependent on the men. If you want to have true empowerment and true women liberalization, your strategy of feminism and your tactic cannot be dependent on what the men perceive as beautiful and what the men perceive as desirable, because we don't see any other way through which sexuality and hypersexualization in the society can be defined. For all these reasons, we beg you to propose the motion.
Thank you. We now have the
Mr. Speaker, I have to ask, like, the main goal of side government here is to have a more inclusive feminism, right? But to which we ask that, what's really the point of all that? If at the end of the day, you try to exclude your more extreme members under the guise of having a feminism that is more acceptable, that more people can feel included under. If it means that you're compromising what you think is important on the basis of what people think they're comfortable with, we think that the kind of feminism that bows down to the structures today that are bound in patriarchy and which are still slowly being dismantled is one that is devoid of value, of the feminism that compromises itself with those very things. I'm going to talk to you about three things here. I'm going to tell you about the value of extremism. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the impact on conservative societies. And thirdly, funny enough, I'll talk about the male gaze, right? But before that, I have several things to talk about in terms of the speaker before me, or the two speakers before me. Firstly, is this idea that, that in terms of strategy, you need to focus on domestic violence and suffrage. As you rightly pointed out, is that sexual independence or bodily autonomy should not be decoupled from the fight for feminism. Things like birth control, things like your ability to divorce and marry are important issues that are coupled with that. So we think that's very important for us to recognize that in the first place. So secondly, is this idea of the impact on young girls and women in terms of the expectation that you place on them. Firstly, we denied that. We rejected that characterization to begin with because we argued that the very idea, what it means is we have two responses to this. Firstly is that women should not consider necessarily the impact on other women before they start to do other things. If they do that, that means they're putting the interests of other human beings before themselves, which is antithetical to the whole prospect of bodily autonomy to begin with. But secondly, what this does, and this is what Jay talked about, is that it creates room for discussion in that hypersexual women are generally seen as outliers anyway. They're seen as the fringes of what women are. But what it means, and what Jay pointed out, is that within the feminist movement, or within feminism as a whole, there's a variety of other prominent females who can become role models. Women like Ellen Page, like Ellen DeGeneres, right? Not just Kim Kardashian, and the kind of characterization that they have of hypersexual women. But thirdly, so that's number two. Thirdly, is this idea of how it crowds out constructive feminism, right? We think that's like a sneaky word for them to try to say that this is the things that we want to fight for, and what you're doing by having hypersexualizing all other women who don't fit that. We don't think that's true nowadays. Nowadays, when you have many narratives of what it means to be a woman, like what it means to be a lesbian, or what it means to be bisexual, means that there's a variety of these different narratives. So we think that simply having one or a few hypersexual women doesn't shift the entire discourse entirely to being sexual all of a sudden. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have all these other non-sexual women who fit this idea of what it means to be like an hourglass figure dominating. There are many women out there who dominate that kind of idea to begin with. We think that what's important here is that what they're essentializing feminism is that they're saying that these prominent females, if they move to what they think is this vision of acceptable feminism, is a compromise with the status quo patriarchy, like what we're essentially comfortable with. Let's go on to my first idea. It's a very short one, right? About the value of extremism, right? What we argue is that that these women are essentially carrying forward the fight, or it's a logical extension of what happened in the 1960s when women were burning their bras. In that back then, that was seen as being something that was overtly sexual, or something that denied the role within these societies. That was something that was seen extreme back then, but nowadays it seems rather moderate, it seems rather normal. The idea behind extremism, or why we need to embrace or at least not reject them or regret them, is that the idea of pushing boundaries means that it establishes a moderate middle ground that is seen as more credible, and establishes everyone else a kind of room and space to wish to discuss. Yeah.
Everyone in the 1960s, or every woman, had the opportunity to burn her bra if she wanted to. The difference with the hypersexualization women is movement. It's not every woman has the body type or body image to get 100,000 retweets on the photo. Tell us why this doesn't hurt the body image of young girls that look up.
Look, the idea behind hypersexualized women is that they say, if you want to be hypersexual, you can, right? It's not saying that you have to be hypersexual in order to get the attention of everyone else. And I think that's what this team is missing out this debate. They say that simply by being a hypersexual woman, you're saying that the only way in which you capture the attention of males and females alike is by being hypersexual. That's absolutely not true. We think that's absolutely ridiculous. But secondly, let's deal with this idea that they have on the impact of conservative societies. We would argue that in conservative societies where there's a nascent feminist movement, this would have little. Why? Because in these societies where women already denied the right to vote and the right to drive, seeing hypersexual women will suddenly what? Not give them more rights to vote and not more rights to drive? Like, that doesn't make any second, and it's very important, right? Moderates can use this extremism and compare and use it as leverage. They're going to say that, hey, look, that Western kind of feminism is something that's very extreme. But look at us, we're just asking for the right to vote. We're just asking for the right to try. And we met far more that kind of society that looks at these kind of forms of feminism, expressions of which there are, the kind that they want to talk about, against domestic violence and all. It's far more achievable when you acknowledge that the kind of that even without intending to do so, hypersexual women set these ranges that make it far more acceptable than things that you currently want to become kind of acceptable. Look, it's a huge urban myth that the only reason why Martin Luther King Jr. got like the civil rights movement is because they had a movement of peace, right? The reason why the whites were willing to grant these rights because the obvious alternative was a militant black movement powered by Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, which is to say that the blacks said that if you don't give us these rights, we're going to be more militant and we're going to be more extreme. That's the kind of nightmare image you're going to give these conservative societies, that this is the kind of feminism that you would resort to if you want granted such moderate rights. Lastly, this idea of the male gaze. Look, if we were to agree, you know, not conceding, right? Assuming but not conceding, that the male gaze is indeed something that these women look forward to in terms of, you know, empowerment and all that. All these women are doing is making use of the current structure, the patriarchy against itself. Right? We don't think that's problematic. That means what's wrong with being able to use whatever structures are in there to benefit yourself and to help yourself. At the end of the day, this debate is not about, should not be about society or feminism imposing values on women, which is to say that as a woman, you shouldn't think, am I benefiting feminism before you do something? We think that's antithetical to the idea of feminism. This idea that you have to sacrifice the notion of self in order to, or you need to be a martyr to feminism in order to forward its cause, we're absolutely proud to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, government thinks that feminism, the best feminism, should be about caring about the most vulnerable women in society. That's why we practice it behind this motion. In my written speech, we're going to be covering two things. All of those will be integrated. First, we're going to talk about the point of narratives and diversities. And secondly, we're going to be talking about actual empowerment and how we want to advance the feminist movement on side proposition. Okay, getting into this idea of nuances and diversity. Okay, so we've heard this point up and down the op-ed about individual autonomy. How no one can claim or no one can assert outside what it means to be a woman and can assert that principle for other people, right? Well, on government, we recognize that there's a trade-off between the autonomy of a woman and her societal impact, right? We never claimed and we never proclaimed that women should be allowed to broadcast their bodies. We don't think that they should not be stripped of their right to broadcast or hypersexualize themselves. What we say is that in the event of that, we regret this motion, right? We think that these celebrities and these prominent women figures are in a position where they have wide swaths of influence, right? We heard that analysis coming out of the Prime Minister's speech. Given that position, they're in a place where that many women and many girls around the world look up to them as role models, right? We would say that in that position, they then have a trade-off to make between exercising that autonomy to hypersexualize the body and the societal impact that will occur as a result of them broadcasting those images, right? We tell you that, yes, they do have the right to do so, but we regret the impact that it has on the feminist movement, right? In the question of, like, what do we mean by this hypersexualized image, we think that they're like images, videos, social media, sex tapes that all came out in the Prime Minister's speech. Furthermore, we've given you this nuanced analysis demonstrating the limited amount of narratives in the feminist sphere, right? We heard this coming out of the opposition side of people, right? When they talk about how this is ultimately just an example of extreme. What we would tell you is that's a total misrepresentation of everything we talk about inside government. This is not something like a spectrum, right? We have some moderate feminists and some extreme feminists that just use more extreme tactics of the moderate feminists, right? What we would tell you is that this hypersexualization movement and associating hypersexualization implicitly with empowerment is antithetical to feminism. It's not an extreme form of feminism. What we tell you is that it's not. It goes against and silences the other voices of the feminist movement. That's why we regret it, right? We would tell you that if you want, and they talk about like passing birth control, you know, limiting domestic violence, achieving education in developing countries. feminists. If we want that to happen, we need to create a feminist narrative within the media that is subscribable to all women, right? If we actually want, when they talk about like, getting women having more access to birth control in these countries, those types of women are not going to subscribe to a feminist narrative that implicitly excludes them, right? In their countries where societal norms, where implicit narratives exclude them from being able to broadcast their body in a certain way, that actually goes against the ability of the feminist movement to progress, right? Okay, moving on. We think that other types of modern feminism, like that Cheryl talked about in her speeches, like women wanting to wear the hijab, women that think that true feminism is actually reclaiming the woman's body. If our ultimate goal is to advance legitimate accomplishments towards the feminist agenda, to do that, we must regret feminism that is inherently alienating and divisive. We think that people who cannot express themselves in certain ways that other women in ultra-liberal Western countries can, because of cultural norms, because of laws, therefore they can't identify with those prominent women, right? So why do we care? Like, what is the actual impact of this study? We think that feminism should be about caring about the most vulnerable women, not the most privileged women who, because of their status within these countries, have the privilege and the right to broadcast their body in a certain way. The result of that is that it crowds out non-Western, non-liberal discourse about what it means to be feminist. We think that they're arguing for like a privileged, antithetical version of actually what it means to be a feminist, right? So this whole entire argument that the second speaker spent so much time on about how talking about there is like a spectrum of feminism, we say that that's actually not the case, right? We would tell you, and even if it were, we would say that if one type of feminism were so harmful that it harms and it crowds out other voices, it necessarily harms the other narratives, we then therefore regret its existence, right? They've ignored time and time again our analysis about the characterization of what it means to be hypersexual, what it means to broadcast your body in a certain way. We tell you that that sort of action is visceral, it's public, it attracts a lot of attention, right? Then we would tell you that it's unique and greater than above other scales of feminism that purport other means to achieve these feminist goals, right? What that means is that it necessarily crowds out these other narratives, silences voices, and is antithetical to the feminist movement. Yeah.
If you're saying that hypersexual women shift narrative towards sexuality being what it means to be feminist, are you then saying that Ellen Page, Ellen DeGeneres, Yuna, hijabis suddenly become irrelevant to the feminist movement? Okay.
No, they don't become irrelevant, they become less relevant. The reason why is because women that look up to these figures, that hypersexualize these bodies, cannot achieve this, right? And in response to their argument about like, yes, there are other narratives that women should subscribe to, the difference between hypersexualization is that it's not, there's no like equality opportunity there. And this is moving into our second idea of empowerment, right? They totally missed all of our analysis that we gave about the unrealistic expectations and the body image issues that this policy and that this type of feminist sets for young girls and women around the globe, right? We would tell you that when you explicitly tie feminism to being predicated on women being perceived as a sexual object and an object of desire, we would tell you that not all women fall into the conventional body type of these prominent celebrity figures that exercise that hypersexualization. Not all women will be able to fit into that body type, into that norm. What that means is that yes, all women can get behind these universal ideas of education, because that is something that all women should subscribe to. Yes, all women can get behind the idea of birth control, because that is an actual goal realization that can be achieved in all countries eventually. But what cannot happen is all women cannot look the same or not look like the Kim Kardashians, even though they may want to. That's just something that cannot happen, right? But what that means is that this type of feminism is inherently stagnant. It cannot evolve beyond women being perceived as sexual objects, necessarily because we've given you this analysis of how it crowds out other narratives, because of its inherent nature as a sexualized image, because it cannot evolve, because the empowerment is not tied to the rights of women, something that is palatable to women around the world to actually advance goals of the feminist agenda, but only really appeals to a certain privileged segment of women. That's why it's divisive. That's why we're proud to propose this motion. Thanks.
Thank you. We have this motion.
Walls are super thin.
It was ironic they instead wanted to deny empowerment on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Because you have to understand that females on that side of the House could not subscribe to feminism as much as they wanted, because you have this direct and objective standard what exactly feminism can be. But the conceptualization of feminism on that side was more of a, you can't really sit with us because of who you are. The value of feminism, Mr. Speaker, should be subject to an exclusive club that denounces sexualization and instead wants to shut it at the end of the day. I have two issues to answer within my speech. Firstly, what does hypersexuality mean for a person? And here's where we talk about a scale of whether or not it does impact society as a whole, or is it more about whether or not it impacts a person? Second, Mr. Speaker, does hypersexuality break up the movement that they want to talk about at the end of the day? So first things first, what does hypersexuality then mean for a person? That side wanted to argue things such as, well, there's a standard of hypersexuality that you then set for other women. But when we ask them exactly what would be an acceptable standard of what hypersexualization is, they only say that as long as you're moderate, then we're okay with it. But as long as we then can still group you into a more moderate feminist point of view, then at least that can be acceptable under the other side. But the larger problem that they had was, well, they didn't really want to tell us that your ability to affect other women as a metric, but not yourself, was the metric that they wanted to use, and somehow it was all about being a good feminist. I'll tell you why this is not the metric of you being able to be a prominent person who can affect other people within society in three responses. First, there seems to be a double standard of who can hypersexualize under that side of the house, because if you're a prominent figure, you can't really hypersexualize because other people will be influenced by you. But secondly, if you're not a prominent figure, then somehow you can hypersexualize because no one really cares about who you are or what you then can do. But secondly, Mrs. Speaker, that means that you deny the ability for certain prominent figures to empower themselves when it comes to hypersexuality at the end of the day. No, thank you. So that means you deny the ability for people like Kim Kardashian to also empower themselves through hypersexuality because you deny it just because they have the fame and other people somehow don't. Thirdly, Mrs. Speaker, we argue that people that they want to talk about with all this perfect bodies like Kim Kardashian don't really have a moral obligation to pick up your definition of what a good feminist is, because we think that blames them more for not buying into this idea that you want to set, other than them thinking that hypersexuality means more to them. So what does hypersexuality then mean on the outside of the house? Three things. First, that's for the empowerment of a bodily autonomy more than anything else in a certain scenario, right? To deny and to denounce the ability for these women to subscribe to hypersexualization means that you demean and you denigrate the ability and the value of this woman who choose to subscribe towards it. Secondly, no thank you, that we don't really care, Mr. Speaker, about the cost of you delegitimizing people on that side who still do not choose to hypersexualize, because we think that the link in for you to say that, you know, somehow there are women who wear hijabis will be affected on the other side of the world will still not choose to hypersexualize because there are conservative environments that exist in that certain scenario anyway, and this is considered really sexual, like this is considered extreme in those certain circumstances. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we think that different females on the status quo can set different standards for yourself, and you're able to make conceptualizations of your own body for yourself. Meaning to say, you think that hypersexualization is something that you want to subscribe to, and it should be an option that will be available for you. That means that the person should be able to recognize sexuality is that for yourself first, then it is for other people. So let's further deconstruct this idea of hypersexuality itself, in which they wanted to argue on three things. First, they wanted to tell us that, well, we don't really care, but as long as your figure is really amazing, and there are some people out there who don't really have amazing figures, then you set this idea of a beauty standard that other women who are vulnerable will feel as if they are disempowered by this, right? Firstly, I don't think Kim Kardashian wants to post big pictures of herself to make other people within the world feel insecure about themselves anyway. But second, Mr. Speaker, just because you post a picture of yourself doesn't mean you're out there to demean and denigrate the bodies and figures of other people, right? But thirdly, arguing that there's an objective standard of what people think is the perfect body means that you also do not allow other people to not even just hypersexualize, but sexualize and understand that they are and their own body is something they can be happy with. But thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that the idea of how men under that side of the house will say that now that women sexualize, it's easier for us to buy into this narrative that you allow yourself to be blamed for this, means that if you do not want to hypersexualize at all, means that you are exactly making it more palatable for men to then become sexist, and we don't think it's justified under that side of the house. Let me move on to my second issue, but before that, sure.
The problem is that if you have a large viewership, and your responsibility extends to the fact that young kids get anorexia because of body image issues, it is your moral responsibility as a feminist, if you're self-prescribed, to limit your harm to those people.
Look, well, just because you post a new picture of yourself doesn't mean you're setting standards for other people out there. We told you that hypersexualization is about what and who you want to think about yourself and not about other people at the end of the day. We don't think anorexia is a burden that we have to prove or we have to like somehow make it on the outside of the house. That's proof to you at the end of that. So let's talk about this class about hypersexualization, right? Provided the space in which we told you that hypersexualization is a thing that people have to subscribe to themselves first, then only somehow we can care about other people, means that you at least provide a space in which other women out there can navigate their way around it. So we don't have to talk about it, we don't have to defend about all these women who feel insecure about themselves, Mr. Speaker, if you can at least reasonably assess that hypersexualization is something that you cannot reach, for example, or secondly, think that your own body at that current given time is at least something that you're then happy with. It isn't an imposition, Mr. Speaker, but a standard, not even a standard, but an idea that we want other women to then subscribe to, should they choose to do so. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, does hypersexuality then break up the movement as a whole? And here's where we get the idea of how political capture is something, media capture is a thing that they wanted to argue. We need to start thinking that this feminist movement of hypersexuality is something that drags away the feminist movement away from understanding what exactly feminism is. But we tell you on the outside of the house, Mr. Speaker, that hypersexuality stretches the extremities of what can be understood as what sexuality actually is. Two things to talk about. First, media capture isn't really a zero-sum game when it comes to this resource of what we can use when it comes to discussion, Mr. Speaker. We still think that stretching the extremities will create a better avenue for people to talk about what exactly is good, what exactly can be hypersexuality at the end of the day. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, it's the idea of conservative people within the Middle East, for example. At least we create a discussion between liberal people that they want to talk about and also conservative people who exist in the Middle East to bridge a gap when it comes to issues such as what body autonomy should that be under the feminist movement at the end of the day. Following that of the house, Mr. Speaker, you understand that there's an adversarial movement such as conservative feminism looking up to liberal feminists and saying that isn't really the kind of feminism that we want to subscribe to, Mr. Speaker, and that is wrong. But instead it becomes one where there's an ability for you to become allies, understanding that there are different circumstances that the liberal feminists and conservative feminists live in. We are proud of those.
Thank you.
A year ago, I was wearing the hijab and I had my own concept of feminism. Right now, I don't, and I still have my own predetermination of what feminism is and how I feel empowered throughout my identity. And that's the great thing about feminism, Mr. Speaker, because we acknowledge that there is a spectrum of how individuals choose to identify in their forwarding their values of themselves and how they choose to empower. And we don't think it is like removed actively or becomes a vacuum just because some outlier female celebrity starts posting up nude selfies like Kim Kardashian. We think individuals can still be able to internalize what it necessarily means for me to choose my own method of empowerment and how do I best move forward. Let's compare the burdens in this debate. And I'm going to break down the issues with this particular debate and why we proved our burden and they didn't. So we took on a burden to say that the act of engaging in hypersexualization embraces different parts of empowerment and breaks down monolithic concept of feminism. They took a burden to say that there is a good feminism that is most inclusive and will bolster the fight for feminism. Let's break this down and assess women. Firstly, what is the value of being a prominent figure? Let's agree that there is a notion that exists in this debate that you must set a standard because so many people look up to you and will be influenced by you. Let's make that comparative then. Under their role, the influence that you set is that you must often limit your sexuality because people can't accept it. That you must delete your sexuality because it is not palatable. That you must compromise your value in order for it to be palatable to the larger community. What is outside of the house portrayed as a form of like influencing gentlemen? That you can choose your own method of empowerment in how you choose to dress, how you choose to forward your body image, or how do you choose to like present yourself to society, and independent of whether you're a prominent figure or not, but also that you can determine your value of self. But the great thing about prominent figures is that they put forward a message of I can do it, therefore you can do it as well. If you don't like what I'm doing, you may explain your counter narrative. That's what we mean by like strategic management solutions, right? And that's really important. And let's compare the breakdown. We show you that at least there are permutations of the concept of identity and break down patriarchal standards that you must accept a particular baseline. I don't even know what that baseline was. It's still ambiguous at this point, as opposed to their notion of inclusivity, which is pretty ridiculous at this point. Because they say inclusivity can sacrifice some individuals for the larger majority, and we think that's antithetical to the concept of like equality and empowerment. Oh, and when you say we are very willing to sacrifice individuals who hypersexualize themselves for the greater good of other women in these communities, that's a very privileged statement making this debate. Secondly, how does it impact the discussion surrounding feminism? I'm going to break it down according to the burden as well. In our world, we break down monolithic essentializing of feminism when you see there is a set standard of what it means to be a feminist. They say what happens right now on the that side of the house is that the discussion will be hijacked because it's very visceral in nature. Let's look at the reaction to specific communities on a comparative. On the that side of the house, when you're talking about moderate communities, for example, what you show with these individuals that in order for you to be a good feminist and a good woman, you need to be able to be grouped up with a larger group of individuals as opposed to embracing your individual identity. On the outside, we say that we acknowledge there are differences in the categories of women all around the world, and therefore moderate communities will be more likely to accept the fight for equality. When you talk about extremely conservative communities, something that Nick has spoken about, never responded to, is that patriarchal structures will reject you nonetheless, right? We don't think they were able to move a massive leap between what happens in status quo and what they're going to do in the change that discussion. We say what happens right now is that feminist group can start the discussion on a version and say, that's not really what we want. We want the ability to have the right to education, the right to birth control, or the right to individual autonomy, and not like the right to post nude selfies, ladies and gentlemen, making it far less likely that conservative society will be reactive adverse. We think when you always have to tailor your notion of feminism to men, you're using patriarchy to fight patriarchy, and it doesn't really make sense in this world, ladies and gentlemen. Because people will always fall back to this behavior to determine what they do and how they react to communities. We think that it has to be a lot more constructive, very practical.
Thank you.
It's clear what kind of feminism science opposition wants. And we don't want a kind of feminism that is a subculture of women in the West who have a super liberal position, that have the privilege to act if they are already liberated to the degree, but acknowledging at the same time that this kind of feminism alienates other people, does not make other people join their ranks, and thus legitimizes their power in places where they need feminism the most. Developing countries, poor communities, more conservative communities, whether in the West or developing countries. And that is problematic. And that's exactly how it happens. Because if we view hypersexualization as a strategy for empowerment of women, that is what feminism is at risk of becoming. One kind of feminism shuts down all the other women, and we believe that is bad. So, firstly, is feminism a spectrum, or is it a policy, or is it a strategy? We believe that it can be both. We believe that even if it's a spectrum, it is unjust to give a huge amount of attention for a few radicals that can achieve that hypersexualization where others cannot. We do not believe that those women are in the majority. And we would rather, if we can bite the bullet and say, yes, we would rather regret that those women exist and they pervert the feminism that they do because it shuts down other women. Now, they said, how does it hijack other women if Ellen DeGeneres is still there in the show? Well, we gave you very simple and clear reasonings as to why this becomes the most popular or the most discussed version, if you will, of feminism. Why? Because words are much less appealing than a very, very sexy image. Because you need to remember that men are also part of the audience, and that women that are conservative are also part of the audience. And they're much less convinced when you use those words that demand a lot more attention, that are much less visceral, that are not images, and that is a limiting factor. And that is exactly how this type of feminism crowds out a lot of other forms of feminism, and we find that very problematic. But even if not, we also do it, because we told you and we gave you unique harms that even if it doesn't crowd out other forms of feminism, it is problematic that these prominent figures use their position to create agendas that actually harm and oppress women even more by promoting unrealistic body image standards. It is not fair for them to come up and say that, no, you can do whatever the hell you want if you're a prominent figure, and it doesn't matter because you're acting on your own individuality. No, we don't believe that that is true if your actions have very real-life consequences to those who looked up to you previously as a feminist icon, but see that they can never be in your position, but wish to be, but can't. It is very problematic when these persons choose choose to take the individualistic approach instead of actually promoting a feminism that is able to include the women that want to be taught because their standards are unrealistic and exclusive. And that is where the political strategy begins. We do believe that actually this kind of feminism, when it's radical, is very harmful. We don't believe that Saudi or Russian women are going to be more likely to subscribe to feminism and to mobilize themselves in a political force if they feel like that kind of feminism that we see on TV and see on the media that is mostly Western is a Western liberal import. We don't believe that you can convince those conservative women, even in the vote for Republicans, that feminism is a worthy enough cause to join. That's exactly how we get women who want to end oppression, but who don't want to join the ranks of feminism, because they believe that feminism is not for them, because they believe that the kind of feminism that gains prominence tells them that they're not worth of feminism because it hijacks the attention, because they're not sexual enough, because they're not sexy enough, and we believe that this kind of feminism is not the kind of feminism that we seek empowerment with. We beg you to.
Surprise!